Hey homies, today we're talking about memory. This is one of two, arguably three modules in which we're talking about memory. And before we really jump into it, I want to get us started on a little bit of an experiment. I'm going to read you out a list of words. I want you to see later how many of these words you can remember. These are actually names. All right, ready? Don't write any of these down yet. I'll ask about them later. McDavid, Crosby, Matthews, Stone, Larkin, Nylander, Hughes, Comrie, Knight, Talbot. Come back to that. So in this module, here's what we're going to be walking through. We'll start with a brief introduction on memory systems versus memory processes, but we're really focusing on systems today. So we'll start talking about the model of memory, short-term and working memory, distinguishing between short-term and long-term memory, and different types of long-term memory, with a special look at episodic and semantic memory. So let's start with memory processes versus systems. In the module, you're going to find a video of Clive Wearing and his presentation of the memory deficits that he has. Clive was a musician living in London when he contracted a herpes virus, the virus that literally usually gives you cold sores. But for some people, for some reason, that virus can invade the brain and produce swelling that can cause long-term and lasting damage. As a result of Clive's infection, he sustained damage to parts of his brain that were important for encoding long-term memories. As a result, his experience was that he was constantly waking up from what felt like an infinite abyss of unconsciousness. He literally couldn't remember what had just happened, and so it felt like he hadn't been consciously aware, even though he was. His caregivers encouraged him to start a diary in order to give his life a sense of continuity, but the diary was filled with entry after entry where Clive would know what time it was and then write something along the lines of, "First time in my entire life I am awake. First time." And you can see that a lot of his entries are crossed out because he literally was having the experience of waking up for the first time, seeing this notation and thinking like, I didn't write that. That's not true. Now is the first time. Clive's story illustrates, I think, two things really clearly. One, memory is key to who we are. Without it, there is no coherence to our experience. And two, memory is a rubric. It's not just one thing, it's a heading or a title for something that is vast and varied. Why can Clive remember how to write but not the beginning of a question when he gets to the end? Why can he remember his wife but not his doctors? Why isn't Clive surprised that his wife is older? All of this implies that memory is incredibly complex, which is why we're going to spend almost a quarter, almost a quarter of this course talking about memory. So colloquially, we talk about memory in a variety of ways as well. So we talk about memory as a specific piece of information. So I remember this one time at band camp, like it's that specific piece of information. We also talk about memory as the record of information, like this place where we store all of our memories. Like I'm going to go through and search my memory as if there's like sort of a flat file drawer where we keep everything. And then memory is also a set of processes, or probably more accurately, a three processes and their associated processes, which is encoding, storage, and retrieval. So it's not just the information, it's also what we are doing with that information. We're really going to focus on memory systems and memory processes, but we're going to start this section with a focus on memory systems, the systems view. The systems view is really interested in different kinds of memory. So identifying the different kinds of memories that we have, or memory systems that we have, and characterizing those systems. How long does information last? How much information? What's the format of that information? How do we distinguish it from other memory systems? And I'm just going to start with a brief overview. So we will talk about the three major memory systems: sensory memory, short-term memory, and then long-term memory. Sensory memory, we're really going to focus on iconic memory. Researchers know a little bit about echoic memory, but presumably there's a memory store, or a sensory memory store, for each one of the sensory modalities. It's just really hard to study them in the other domains. Short-term memory, we often refer to as working memory, and I'm going to break out that distinction today. And then finally, we talk about long-term memory. Long-term memory can be broadly broken down into declarative and non-declarative, things we can discuss versus things we can't. And then they can be further subdivided into 6 different subdomains of long-term memory. So here is where you can get into Moodle and complete the H5P on memory basics. Okay. The framework that we use to organize the systems view of memory is called the modal model of memory. And the modal model of memory should look pretty familiar. This is one of the models that exploits the computer metaphor for cognition, and it has a lot in common with the information processing approach. The basic skeleton is actually very similar to the information processing approach, but this is now very specific to memory. So Atkins and Shiffrin's model is really interested in identifying these memory systems and characterizing them based on how long information can be stored, how much information can be stored, and what kinds of information can be stored. So for each one of these memory systems, we can ask how much, how long, what code. The first memory store that we're going to talk about is sensory memory. Sensory memory contains information from the senses that outlasts the sensory stimulus itself. So it's a mental representation that outlasts the stimulus. For iconic memory, we're talking about vision. And we're really going to keep our discussion today focused on vision and iconic memory. Researchers know a little bit about echoic memory, but the presumption is that there is a sensory memory store for each one of the different sensory modalities. It's just that we know the most about iconic memory. I'm going to show you several dots scattered on the screen for 100 milliseconds. I want you to see how many you can count. So we'll do 2 trials. Let me turn myself off. Ready? How many dots? If you identified 5, accurate. All right, let's do this again. One more trial. How many there? If you guessed 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, you're in good company. That's typically the range that I get when I ask this of students in class. And the answer is there's actually 11 dots. But I can tell, because I'm a cognitive psychologist, I know that a lot of students are going to say that even if they accurately reported 11, it's impossible to tell which ones a participant has actually counted. And most of the time what participants report is that they have counted some subset, some number of dots. Maybe you can count up to 5, 6, maybe even 7, and then you know there's more, but they fade out of iconic memory before you have the opportunity to count them. So what you do, or what most people do, is they count to like 7-ish, and then they say, okay, there's more, and they guess a higher number. But what that means for a researcher is that I don't know if a participant is guessing 11 because they actually counted 11 and they think there's 11, or if they're guessing 11 because they counted 7 and then just made a really good guess. So researchers moved on from this kind of test of iconic memory and very quickly started using letter arrays. Letter arrays, like the stimulus on the right, would allow researchers to identify not only which items a participant was actually reporting, but whether or not it was an accurate report or if they were just guessing. We're going to look at a couple of trials here. So again, I'm going to turn off my camera, and I want you to fixate at the plus sign. So look directly at it and try not to move your eyes. I'm going to flash up the array. What I want you to do is write down any of the letters that you have encoded. So pause right now, go get a piece of paper and a pen if you don't have one in front of you. And we are going to go through a couple of trials. Ready? Here's the array. You can judge whether or not you were right. Let's do another trial. So on this trial, I want you to try harder. All right, ready? And here's the array so you can judge your accuracy. Last trial. So because this is the last trial, I really want you to try hard. Try really, really hard, okay? Ready? Here's that letter array for you to test yourself or to judge your accuracy. So when I was telling you to try harder, that might have been a little bit frustrating, but I was actually trying to force you into adopting a particular strategy. And this is what Sperling heard from his participants. So George Sperling was the major researcher in this area of iconic memory, and he started using these iconic memory studies with the letter arrays. But he was actually talking to his participants, and participants told him explicitly that they were adopting a very specific strategy. They said that because the letter arrays were so overwhelming and they knew they were never going to be able to report the whole thing, a lot of participants actually confessed that they were pre-selecting rows to report because they knew that if they at least focused on the top row or the middle row, they would be able to report that row for sure. And then they just wouldn't worry about the rest. They might be able to get a couple of more like outside of the row that they were looking at, but then at least they would get the row. So Sperling decided to exploit this strategy, and he really wanted to get at this question of what is the total amount of information that's accessible during iconic memory. And the idea here is that George Sperling really thought there's probably more information making it into iconic memory. It just fades before people can report it. So how do you get at this idea of how much information is actually accessible during iconic memory? And for this, he basically created a new version of the iconic memory experiment that he called the partial report condition. So in the partial report condition, participants would be shown the array, and then they would be given a tone at the exact moment that the array disappeared. A high tone meant that they should report the top row, a middle tone meant that they should report the middle row, and a low tone meant they should report the bottom row. And so here's the logic of that experiment. If you show the participants the array briefly and then you deliver the tone at the exact moment that the array disappears, you're forcing participants to report information from iconic memory. The stimulus itself is gone, so they have to rely on the icon. So here we have along the y-axis the proportion of correct items reported as a function of the queue delay. So whether or not the queue was simultaneous with the offset of the stimulus array versus if it was delayed out to 100, 200, 300, or 400 milliseconds. And what you can see is that iconic memory has a brief duration on the order of a few hundred milliseconds because you see a rapid decay in performance with most information becoming inaccessible within about 300 to 500 milliseconds. So that dotted line represents the whole report condition, where participants could report on average between 4 and 5 items out of 12. Out of 9. Whereas in the partial report condition, participants could actually report with zero delay. They could report almost the entire row. And the logic is that if they can report the entire row, they must have access to the entire array, because they didn't know which row they were going to have to report beforehand. So the partial report advantage indicates that iconic memory is time limited rather than capacity limited. The amount of information in iconic memory is probably most of our visual display, but it just fades within about 300 milliseconds, so that we can't access it after that period of time. And you know what? It doesn't need to be longer than that. The point of sensory memory is to help us stitch together our world. So if you have this view, this is me in my apartment, where you're looking around a display or looking around an environment, your brain is taking samples or taking snapshots of this environment, and iconic memory is allowing that information to last long enough so that you can stitch it all together and produce like a full and rich environmental representation. Okay, let's talk about short-term and working memory. What exactly is short-term memory? Psychology has a very interesting definition. Cognition in particular has a very interesting definition of short-term memory. It's very specific. So short-term memory is what you are thinking about right now. It is your current awareness. It's what you're rehearsing. It's what you just experienced. It is this moment and maybe about 30 seconds back. Some information gets transferred to long-term memory, but most information that makes it into short-term memory gets lost. So short-term memory is the system involved in storing small amounts of information for a brief period of time. But we have to ask these questions of how much and how long. We're going to start with how long. So decay is the passive loss of information from a memory store due to the passage of time. And the idea was that decay sets in as soon as we stop rehearsing. Researchers felt that this was how information was lost from short-term memory. So the question is, how fast does information decay from short-term memory? To answer this question, two groups of researchers created exactly or nearly exactly the same paradigm nearly simultaneously in the UK and the US. It was Brown in the UK and Peterson in the US. So this paradigm is referred to as the Brown-Peterson paradigm. So on each trial, participants were given 3 consonants and a number that they would have to count backwards by 3 until they got a cue to recall that trigram they'd just been given. The time interval that they would be counting backwards by 3 varied in order to track how long information would stay. The reason why both researchers included this manipulation where in the interim participants would need to count backwards by 3 was because they wanted to prevent participants from rehearsing information. If short-term memory lasts for as long as you're thinking about it, you have to figure out a way to prevent participants from thinking about it. So that was the count backwards by 3. So you get a consonant trigram, FZL, some number to count backwards by, and then after a few seconds, a recall. Consonant trigram, number, recall cue. Consonant trigram, number, recall cue. So using this method and over hundreds of trials, the researchers were able to trace out this memory curve. So here we've got along the y-axis percent correct recall as a function of that retention interval. And you can see immediately there's a precipitous drop, right? So you start out at around 90 and you really quickly decrease from there. And so by the time we get to 18 seconds out, participants are now essentially at 0% correct recall, suggesting that information lasts in short-term memory if you prevent rehearsal for about 20 seconds. Now, most researchers recognize that there is error in measurement, and so we actually say somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds. Like it's short, basically, is the point. It's not that sort of 30-second-ish range. But there's something weird about this graph that I really want you to consider. Look at it. What is something that you might think is potentially weird and maybe even alarming? I'm going to say it is that accuracy at the 0 retention interval delay. It's 90%. You might think 90% is pretty good, but if I just give you 3 letters and immediately ask you to tell me what those 3 letters are, and you can't do that, that's weird. Why can't you do that? So short-term memory lasts between 20 and 30 seconds, but Brown and Peterson all thought it was due to decay. However, decay is a passive loss of information just due to the passage of time, but some researchers propose that it was actually due to interference. Interference refers to the idea that information interferes with or in some way hinders the retrieval of other information. I've got this image here of like some static. This is like back in the day when you had like bunny ears to try to get your channels working. You would see these sorts of interference. And so the idea here is that interference is not forgetting, it's competition for retrieval. It's an active process that represents competition. That is, it's not that your brain or your mind cannot remember which piece of information. It actually is just calling up too many pieces of information at once and going like, do you want this one? Do you want this one? Do you want this one? I want to take a little bit of a detour here and explain to you the classic effects of interference and just like sort of break out this concept a little bit. So interference is when different memory traces compete with each other for retrieval, making it difficult to access the desired information. And there's 2 different flavors of interference, retroactive and proactive. Retroactive interference refers to the fact that recently acquired information can interfere with older information. So you learn list 1, then you learn list 2, and because you learned list 2, you have difficulty recalling list 1. I've got this image here of a boxer because way back in the day, I needed a mnemonic to remember the difference between retroactive and proactive interference. And I'm literally taking the root word, and that's the information that is literally being beat up. So with retroactive interference, it's the older information that's being beat up. With proactive interference, you have previously acquired information that interferes with new learning. So you learn list 1 and you learn list 2. Because you learned list 1, you have difficulty learning list 2. So it's the newer information that is getting beat up. So proactive interference. To illustrate this concept, I've got a short story from when I lived in Taiwan. So I lived there right after undergrad for a year to study Mandarin and apply to grad school. And I also taught English. In the mornings, I would go running around the cultural center because it had this huge overhang that would produce a great shadow. And so it was hot. It's a great place to run, and a lot of people would exercise there. One day I was running around the cultural center, and an older Taiwanese man saw me, and his face kind of lit up. So I stopped to talk to him because he clearly wanted to have a chat with me. And it was surprising that he spoke English. That was very shocking because at the time, if anybody around you was capable of speaking English, they were probably going to be under 25. And this guy was in his 80s. So he asked me, how do you do? And we were chatting in English. And he asked me in English, he asked me, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Canada. And he said, est-ce que vous parlez français? And I literally replied, "不会, 不会," which is in Mandarin, that means I am unable to do that. I was like, I can't, no, no, Even though I started the conversation in English, my brain essentially went like, oh, he's speaking to you in a foreign language. answering the one you know, and the one that I knew in the moment was Mandarin. Not that I didn't speak French. I did learn shitty high school French all the way through high school. Est-ce que je peux aller à la salle de bain? But like I can't really speak French. So what kind of interference is this story describing? Well, first I learned English, then I learned French, and then I learned Mandarin. And because I learned Mandarin, I was no longer able to access French and arguably English. So that would be the older information getting beat up, which is an example of retroactive interference. So researchers picked up on this idea that it was weird that accuracy kind of started at 90%. Why would it be so low? And they used that to actually come up with a reason to reanalyze the data. The researchers who published this didn't actually redo the experiment. What they did was reanalyze the results from Brown and from Peterson and Peterson. And what they looked at was the percent correct when you go from just a 3-second delay to an 18-second delay. And you could see just partialing out those trials with a 3-second delay and an 18-second delay, you see that huge decrement in performance. So people go from like 90% down to 0% in that time, or 75 down to 0% in that time. But what if you looked at just the first trial with a 3-second delay and the first trial with an 18-second delay for each participant? So it's before they've had a chance to see hundreds of trials, before they've had an opportunity to develop a lot of interference. What is their accuracy rate? And you can see that accuracy does not diminish between 3 and 18 seconds. So it's not that information is decaying in that 15-second delay. What's happening is that over the course of the experiment, you're building up interference. And so before you have a lot of interference, you're still capable of remembering that 3-letter consonant trigram up to a really high accuracy. Now, what does this mean? How do we interpret this? Does this mean that information in short-term memory lasts longer than 30 seconds? You know what? Honestly, probably not, because the whole idea is that information in short-term memory is constantly being bumped out by new information. So it's not just that information is passively like leaking out of our working memory or of our short-term memory. Instead, it's just constantly being replaced with new thoughts. And we are seeing that in that interference over many trials, but you don't see that interference in just one trial when you first are initially introduced to a task. There's just not that much interference built up. So if the answer to this question, how long does information last in short-term memory, is like somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds. The next question we have to answer is, how long does information last in short-term memory? And in 1956, George Miller published a paper called The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2. In this paper, he suggested that the average number of items that a person could keep in short-term memory was literally 7 items plus or minus 2. But recent research revisiting this idea suggests that we might be overestimating things. For example, we can only keep track of 4 possible stimulus response associations, and 7 is way out of our realm of possibility. But in either case, Miller wasn't specifically talking about numbers and letters. He was talking about items. So numbers, letters, words, phrases, ideas, chunks of information. I'm going to read you out a list of letters, and I want you to see how many that you can recall. So using that piece of paper and pencil you've got beside you. Ready? And you can start writing as soon as I stop reading letters. Ready? G, C, R, C, B, M, S, T, C, P. Okay, so that's like 10 letters. That's a big number of items to remember. It would probably be a challenge for most students. But here's that letter array. Count how many you actually got right. Here's the thing. If I had presented these in a different order, you would have been able to remember all 10 no problem, because we've got GST, CBC, RCMP. These are all very Canadian, very easy to remember because they are meaningful units to us. So when you organize information this way, instead of 10 items, you've now got 3 items that you're chunking together. And that's really what chunking is. The chunking refers to the combination of smaller elements into larger, more meaningful units. The idea here is that the elements in a chunk are so strongly associated with each other that they form a meaningful unit, and they're weakly associated with other elements of other chunks. So it's a way for us to organize information. So much of the early research and so much of the data that Miller used to formulate his 7 plus or minus 2 was based on verbal learning. So digit span, letter span, lists of words, all of these being like verbal information. There was a real emphasis on verbal learning. And in the realm of verbal learning, digit span is about 5 to 9 items. But more recent evidence is actually suggesting that capacity is closer to 4 items, particularly when you look at other kinds of stimuli. So in the visual domain, researchers created an experiment where they had patches of color that were presented on a screen and briefly shown before being removed, and another image shown that was either the same or had a change. So here we're going to look at that. You're already looking at this display. This is not legit because in the actual experiment you'd see it briefly, but here's the first image and then here's the second image. Has there been a change between those two stimuli? That's the question. And participants were capable of very accurately identifying whether or not there was a change if the number of color patches on the screen was less than 4. But as soon as you crest over 4, you start to see performance really suffer, suggesting that actually, at least in the visual domain, we're capable of keeping track of approximately 3, maybe 4 items before our capacity is overwhelmed and we start to see a decrement in performance. So at least when we're using visual items, and there's even some evidence from the verbal learning literature that capacity is actually probably closer to 4 items plus or minus 1. By the way, do you remember what kind of task this is? We've seen a version of this experiment before when we were talking about attention. This is actually a version of the flicker paradigm used in change detection experiments. So this is actually just a really extra simplified change detection experiment using the flicker paradigm. All right, so we've got this experiment that suggests that the capacity of working memory, particularly in the visual domain, is probably closer to 4 items. But what if we use more complex stimuli? So researchers have argued that we should be talking about capacity in terms of the amount of information rather than in terms of the number of items that we're seeing. Given the effects of chunking, it's actually a bit odd to talk about the number of items a person can hold in memory. The number of items is probably going to be varied, but it could be that the complexity of the information actually really matters. Researchers repeated that flicker paradigm, that change detection experiment with the squares, using 2 different categories of stimuli. Reproducing their original results using the simple color patches, they found a capacity of approximately 4.4 items before performance really started to decrement. In a second follow-up experiment, the researchers used a different set of stimuli. Instead of using basic color patches, they used these more complex representations of shaded 3-dimensional blocks. and these complex cubes produced a different capacity. So again, change detection experiment, but these are the stimuli. Is there a difference? Participants were now really starting to suffer in their performance after there were more than about 2 items on the screen. So on average, their capacity was 1.6 items. So what's the capacity? Is it 4 items? Is it 1.6 items? How do we take into account complexity? This is the problem. So we need to be able to quantify information, like units of information, the same way that we quantify information in computers as like bits of information. We need some way to do that in cognition to understand what a unit of information is for cognitive processing. For example, if it turns out that simple stimuli have about 4 units of information in them, but more complex stimuli have more units of information from them, then what you want to do is actually do a multiplication. So 4.4 items times 4 units of information and 1.6 items times 11 units of information gives you exactly the same number of units total. So even though these look like different capacities, it could be that these two numbers are equivalent to each other if we could find a way to quantify units of information. But I'll be honest, we haven't been able to do that. There's no agreement on how it is that you can quantify the amount of information, but it does make it really tricky to answer this question about how much information we can encode in short-term memory. It's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 items, but what does an item mean? How complex are those items? When chunky comes in, like how does that factor in? So I'm just going to leave this at saying like this is a complex question and it depends on how you want to answer it. You can make arguments for 7 items plus or minus 2, for 4 items, for 1.6 items. All of these are sort of somewhat valid at this point. So the concept of short-term memory is okay to account for how you remember a phone number, but it doesn't really help to explain how you answer the following question. X is above S, T is beside X. If X is moved to be next to S, is the T above or below the X? Yikes. Let me read that again. X is above S. T is beside X. If X is moved to be next to S, is T above or below the X? In order to do this, you actually don't just maintain the information, you have to be able to manipulate it in the short term. So this is conscious awareness, but you're doing more than just maintenance. And this is where the concept of working memory comes in, because in the short term, we don't just maintain information, we do things, we work with information. So working memory, I think of kind of like a USB. It doesn't have a lot of storage, but it's useful for what you're working on right now. A researcher named Badley came up with the concept of working memory, and the idea is that it's limited in capacity, but according to Badley, working memory also has multiple components. So it's a limited capacity system for the temporary storage and Working memory is a limited capacity system for temporary storage and manipulation of information for complex tasks like comprehension, learning, reasoning, planning, decision making, etc. And working memory is the part of short-term memory that's in charge of maintaining and manipulating information, as well as interacting with long-term memory. So information in working memory is stored in 2 formats. There's the visual spatial sketchpad, which stores information that is visual or pattern based. And then there is the phonological loop, which processes or stores information that is verbal or auditory in nature. Working memory, according to Badley, also has a set of processes that are used to manipulate information, create mental models, and retrieve structured information from long-term memory. It's the central executive that directs the flow of stored information and coordinates these processes. It also helps to coordinate the processes that maintain information in the short term, the visual scribe in the visual spatial sketchpad, and then the articulatory control processes in the phonological loop. And the central executive, as well as each of these systems for maintenance, are limited in capacity. This is essentially our cognitive load. It's the amount of resources and effort we have available to execute cognitive tasks. I've asked you guys this before. How many windows are there in your house? Now, you have the experience of doing that task. Here's a riddle. Two people with the same cognitive abilities and the same number of windows, but one person is faster to count the number of windows. Why? Size of the house. Some of you might be thinking, duh, but it's not actually duh. You're not going anywhere but in your mind. Everything is staying within this tiny space. So there's nowhere to go up here. It's not a given that our memory systems will behave as if there is somewhere to go. So it's interesting that our visual spatial sketchpad actually behaves in ways that are similar to how we would physically behave in terms of mental representations. So the visual spatial sketchpad shares characteristics with the physical manipulation of objects. Researchers looked at this by using and developing a mental rotation task. In a mental rotation task, there's kind of different versions, but in this task, you see an abstract object and another one. The idea here is you have to compare them by mentally rotating them and deciding whether or not they are the same or different objects. So here is a yes if you mentally rotate it. Here is a yes also if you mentally rotate it. And then here is a no. So if you mentally rotate it, you're going to see that they're mismatching each other. Researchers looked at how reaction time varies as a function of how far you have to mentally rotate the object in order to compare them. And what they found was that there is a linear relationship. The further you need to rotate the object mentally, the longer the reaction time. Same as if you were actually rotating an object. So that suggests that the visual spatial sketchpad behaves a lot like it would with the physical manipulation of objects. The phonological loop is in charge of maintaining verbal or visual information. And so the capacity of the phonological loop is about 2 seconds. Sometimes students get confused and assume that this 2 seconds is the duration of information in the phonological loop, but it's literally the capacity. It's how much information a person can encode in the phonological loop. And you've got like about 2 seconds of tape. What that suggests is that there's a certain kind of person who should have a better working memory capacity when it comes to verbal information, and that is fast talkers. Because fast talkers can literally get more information onto that 2 seconds of tape. In fact, we've seen this actually play out in research called in an effect called the word length effect, because it's not only the rate of speech that's going to dictate how much fits into 2 seconds, it's also the length of words. So the word length effect is literally the fact that people have a greater working memory capacity for short words compared to longer words. Because information in the phonological loop is stored verbally, we also see this effect called the phonological similarity effect. So researchers presented lists of words that were either similar sounding or dissimilar sounding and recorded the percent of correct recall that participants were able to report. And what they found is that a list of words that sound similar will be more difficult to recall. Think about how that's going to play out with this finding. Here's the actual data. So this might not actually be what you had anticipated, because similarity you might think would be helpful for recall, but essentially it produces interference. So if you have a list of like buy, fly, guy, try, you're going to be like, oh, we said fly in there, right? We said ply in there. So the central executive is kind of like the CEO. It's the decider. It is determining how resources are going to get allocated. It's actually doing the manipulation. One of the major jobs of the central executive is response inhibition, which is or for automated or prepotent responses. A prepotent response is a response that's over practiced, and it tends to be stimulus triggered. So, clicking a pen or flicking a light switch, both of those are triggered by environmental stimuli and producing kind of like a highly automated or over practiced response. This is, by the way, is one of the reasons why you shouldn't go grocery shopping when you're hungry, because it's a prepotent response to eat food when you see food. And that's true even if you're not hungry. Actually, you might have had this experience at Thanksgiving dinner or over the holidays where you're sitting at a table that's full of food, you're stuffed, you think I can't eat another bite, and then, as Aunt Helen is telling a story, you find yourself like eating another like corn on the cob or a piece of bread, and you're like, what am I doing? Right? It's because it's a prepotent response that when you see food, you eat food. And this is why you shouldn't go grocery shopping hungry, because while your central executive can inhibit you from eating food at the grocery store, it doesn't have any juice left over to stop you from buying that food. Another prepotent response is reading. When we see words, we automatically read them. It's actually really impossible for us to inhibit that. So you can train up your central executive using meditation. Mindful awareness is the practice of focusing your thoughts on the breath, and it's really, really effective at helping you develop your central executive control. Your automatic response is to follow every thought that pops up. So with meditation, you're practicing inhibiting prepotent responses, and that can actually improve your executive functioning overall. This training your central executive is a transferable skill. That is, training up reaction time doesn't improve anything but reaction time. Training up central executive, though, can transfer to other central executive tasks. And here you can see this in action. I love this study. So researchers looked at the impact of mindfulness practice on a couple of different things. So here we see working memory capacity. Participants were divided into groups that were either getting mindfulness awareness training and practicing meditation, or another group that was spending the exact same amount of time, but this group was learning about nutrition. And they wanted to see, did these have any impact on working memory? The mindfulness group, you can see, was significantly improved in terms of the pre versus post test, showing that mindfulness training actually improved working memory capacity. But interestingly, you're going to see how this transfers, because not only did they see an improvement in working memory capacity for the group that got mindfulness training, they also saw an improvement on accuracy on the verbal GRE. The GRE, if you're not familiar, is the graduate record exam. It's the test that you often have to write in order to get into grad school. It's just kind of like a general logic, comprehension, verbal reasoning test, and it's standardized. The idea with standardized tests is you shouldn't be able to prepare for them. But what this research suggests is that engaging in mindfulness practice can not only improve your working memory capacity, but can help you on tests that seem to measure working memory capacity, like these standardized tests related to the GRE, SATs, etc. So practice on a central executive targeted task appears to have domain general benefits. It'll improve anything that recruits the central executive. Okay, here's where you can go do the short-term and working memory task. Short-term working memory, H5P. Okay. So let's talk about this distinction between short-term memory and long-term memory. Why did we land on this idea of 30 seconds really being that division? Part of this was definitely Brown, Peterson, and their results, but what else? So, short-term memory is what you're thinking about right now, which means that long-term memory is literally anything that's older than about 30 seconds ago. So, what you were doing right before you started this lecture, what you had for breakfast, how you slept last night, stuff that happened last week, a year ago, or 10 years ago. Those are all going to count as long-term memory. So if you're not rehearsing it, if it's not what you've just experienced, then it's going to be long-term memory. Long-term memory is essentially the archive. It's the old stuff. And the idea is that long-term memory is theoretically limitless and theoretically permanent, but obviously information gets lost from long-term memory over time. So not only does long-term memory distinguish itself from short-term memory based on time span, but it does interact with short-term memory. These two memory systems have a lot of crosstalk. For example, you have better short-term memory span for words than for non-words. What this means is that meaningfulness can help you with short-term information recall. So you're using long-term memory, what the words mean, in order to facilitate your short-term memory. So the two memory systems work together. Long-term memory is often providing context for our current awareness. So they're not really separate and independent of each other. So for long-term memory, we can ask these questions: how much, how long, and what is the kind of information? What's the code that's getting encoded? Well, theoretically limitless, theoretically permanent, and then in terms of the code of information, it is semantics. It's based on meaning. You're going to recall the gist of a story, not the exact wording, because you encode the story based on meaning. In a list learning experiment, you might recall sofa instead of couch, or you might recall tulip instead of daisy, because again, you're encoding information in the long term based on meaning. And that should tell you something about how to study. You have to make information meaningful to yourself in order to remember it long term. So there is a classic experiment where researchers present participants with a series of words and then ask them to immediately recall as many words as they can over a series of trials. It allows them to trace out this remembering curve where you're plotting the percent or the proportion of words recalled as a function of their location in the list. And this participants can recall words in any order, but what you do is you plot the probability of recall based on where the word was in the list when they were exposed to the list. And you tend to see this U-shaped function. So you see superior recall for items at the beginning of the list. This is referred to as the primacy effect. And you also see superior recall for items that are at the end of the list, which is called the recency effect. When you're trying to remember these two effects, it's helpful to actually just think about what the words mean. Primacy, primary, like primary school, that's like the first time you go to school, so that's the firstness. Primacy has this firstness about it. Recency is literally like that. Those were the items that were the last presented, so they're the most recently presented items. So think about what these words actually mean rather than trying to memorize them. But why do we see this superior recall for items at the beginning and at the end of the list? The answer is that there's actually two different reasons why you see these benefits. The items that are presented at the beginning of the list tend to be rehearsed very well. So participants, when they start getting these words, will start with verbal rehearsal. But once you get to like 3, 4, 5 items, that verbal rehearsal breaks down. You can no longer do that on each trial. And so you've got this rehearsal that allows you to recall and encode the items from the beginning of the list really effectively. And you also have superior recall for items at the end of the list, not because they're encoded in long-term memory as items at the beginning of the list are, but because you've got that 30-second capacity for short-term or working memory. So information that is presented at the end of a trial is available for immediate report And then you can also, participants learn they can go back and recall items from the beginning of the list later because those items have made it into long-term memory. How do we know this? Well, one of the follow-up pieces of research with a serial position curve is, first of all, you give participants a 30-second delay after the last item. So you don't allow them to engage in recall for at least 30 seconds after the end of the list, and then you can immediately get rid of that recency effect. So that's telling us that really that recency effect is about what's in short-term or working memory. So we've gone through each one of these memory stores. We've answered the question, how much, how long, what code. When it comes to sensory memory, tons. How much? Tons. Most of the sensory information that we are exposed to probably passes through our sensory memory stores for a very brief period of time before they fade, and the code is going to be modality specific. For short-term or working memory, we've got 7 plus or minus 2, ding, except for maybe it's closer to 4, and it kind of depends on how you quantify information. In terms of how long, 18 to 30 seconds, ding, but that's as long as you're not thinking about it and information is not passively lost from that memory store, but is actively replaced through interference. And in terms of what code, we've got verbal learning, visual learning, probably all sorts of different kinds of information, but those are probably the two most predominant codes, is visual and verbal. And then under long-term memory, we've got theoretically limitless, theoretically permanent, and then the code being saved is semantics. It's based on meaning. All right, let's take a moment now to talk about the different types of long-term memory that the systems views have identified. One man has really changed the face of cognitive research more than any other, which is HM, or Henry Molaison. HM was our most famous case study, and he died December 2nd, 2008. I remember that, actually. I remember that vividly because HM had such a huge impact on cognition. HM was a patient who had intractable epilepsy. I think when he was around 11 years old, he got into a bicycle accident and hit his head. And as a result, he developed epilepsy, and intractable epilepsy. By the time he was 27, he was having between 30 and 50 seizures a day, and it was having a real impact on his quality of life. He wasn't able to finish high school. He didn't work. His parents had to take care of him. And so to try to address his situation, neurosurgeons removed bilaterally his medial temporal lobe. And so this is the hippocampus and then parts of the temporal lobe that sort of knuckle around the hippocampus. If you turn over the brain and you pull back the knuckles of the temporal lobe, you'd see like this is where the hippocampus is, and there's all sorts of like bidirectional connections between the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe. So those structures seem to have an important role in memory, which we learned from HM's deficits. Following this bilateral removal of his medial temporal lobes, his epilepsy was essentially resolved, but there were catastrophic consequences to the function of his memory. So following this surgery, HM lost the ability to form new long-term memories while retaining the function of his short-term memory. So episodic memories were specifically affected for him. He had profound deficits. He really liked watching commercials because he could follow it. And, reports are that he got chubby later in life because he could never remember when the last time was that he ate. He worked with the same nurses for years and had to meet them every day over and over again. HM's deficits are very similar to Clive Wearing's deficits. Both of them have what we call anterograde amnesia, an inability to form new long-term declarative memories. Unlike Clive Wearing, HM's awareness of his deficits was less profound, and he had less anxiety and depression around his experience of his memory deficits. So his experience of his memory deficits were not as alarming as Clive Waring's deficits are to him. Working with HM revealed so much to researchers. It is an absolute travesty that he had to sacrifice his memory and essentially any semblance of a normal life. But it gave us a lot of information, and I wouldn't, make that same trade knowingly. I don't think any researcher would, but his case was not for naught. And we learned a lot about memory based on HM's case. So first and foremost, HM's case suggested that long-term memory and short-term memory were distinct components of declarative memory because he had no ability to form new long-term memories, but his short-term memory was fine. Prior to that, researchers had not really made this distinction between short-term and long-term memory, so that was one thing that became clear through HM's case. HM also helped us to make clear the distinction between declarative and non-declarative memory. So he really made it clear memory is not one thing, it's complicated, it's vast and varied. But what we see here is that declarative and non-declarative are different, short-term and long-term are different. HM, part of the way that we found out that procedural memory or non-declarative memory was a distinct system from declarative memory was by using this mirror tracing task. So this task involves presenting participants with a stimulus like this, but using a contraption where they are only seeing a mirror reflection of their performance. You can't see your hands directly, but you can see a mirror of it. And that means that you need to actually translate the signal that you're getting in order to reverse it to accurately be able to trace out this star. They early on in their research with HM, they had him engage in this task. And on the first day, they explained the task to him. He engaged, and there were initially a huge number of errors, but over 10 attempts, you see a dramatic improvement with practice, and practice makes perfect. That's how skills work. Day 2, he comes in, meets the researchers again, explains the task again. Have you ever done this? No, I've never done this. Does the task again, and now we're seeing incredible improvement initially. So over the course of the day, for sure, but also he just started out better than the day before. Day 3, even better performance. Interestingly, on day 3, apparently HM explicitly said to the researchers, like, this seems like it should be harder. I'm really good at this. He had no memory of practicing, but clearly there was some record being kept because his performance is improving. And this is how we get to non-declarative and declarative memory distinctions. So non-declarative is memory that is usually accessed without awareness and cannot be reported. These are skills, like how you ride a bike. But what exactly you're doing when you perform something successfully as a skill, you can't verbalize that. You're not consciously aware of the knowledge you're accessing when you're riding a bike, nor can you verbalize that knowledge. Comparison, declarative memory is memory for information that is consciously accessed. You are aware of how you're accessing it, and it can be described or reported. So things you can declare or verbally talk about. And this is where semantic and episodic memories are categorized. All right, let's talk briefly about episodic versus semantic memory. These are the two forms of memory that I think are the most important for undergrads and how you can learn. All right, so just to give us an overview of where we are, we've talked about sensory memory and we've talked about iconic memory, recognizing that there are other sensory memory systems. We've talked about short-term memory and this further expansion into this concept of working memory and the different kinds of components of working memory. Now we're talking about long-term memory, declarative and non-declarative. And I love talking about non-declarative memory. I teach the psychology of memory at the 3rd year, and non-declarative I think is great. But like I said, I think that where content is most important, most applicable, most useful for you is under the declarative, so episodic and semantic. Episodic really aligns itself with this I remember experience. It's memory for events that you have experienced. In comparison, semantic memory has this more I know component of it. It is memory for facts. Episodic memory typically has spatial and temporal information automatically encoded in the memory, and episodic memory is acquired in a single exposure. That's kind of the definition of it, is that it's based on a single event that you have experienced. Semantic memory, on the other hand, is memory for facts. Usually there's no contextual information, like the time and place where you learn semantic information usually is not encoded with the content. And unlike episodic memory, which is acquired in a single exposure, semantic memory is strengthened through repetition. And in fact, these two things are opposite of each other. Episodic memory, the more experiences that you have that are similar in nature to each other, the less likely you are to be able to remember any one experience. Whereas in comparison, semantic memory, you get strengthened through repetition. Sometimes it can be really difficult to distinguish episodic from semantic memory. So, for example, I'm going to tell you guys a story so that we can look at episodic versus semantic memory. When I was in undergrad, I went to an undergraduate research symposium that was for like a month in Philadelphia. And while we were there, one of the participants actually went to school in Philadelphia, and so she knew people and got us invited to a house party, which was super fun. And I was having a conversation with these two young people. There was a guy and a girl, and we were just chatting, and the guy said, "Oh, I actually don't go to UPenn. I go to GWU." And I said, "What's GWU?" And this girl was like, "Oh, you don't know what GWU is? It's George Washington University. You know, the first president of the United States of America." And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know that George Washington was the first president of the United States. That's really interesting." And she was like, "How did you not know that?" And I was like, "Listen, I have 20 American dollars in my pocket, which is like $100 Canadian, that I will give you right now if you could tell me who our prime minister is at this moment." She could not, neither could he. I kept my $20. And that's how you can feel smug against Americans. So, is that information that I went to a undergraduate research symposium when I was younger in Philadelphia, is that episodic memory or is that semantic memory? And the answer is, depends on what you're thinking about. One way to distinguish really effectively episodic from semantic memory is this idea of mental time travel. Can you go back to the time and the place where you first encountered that piece of information? And if so, that is more aligned with episodic memory. But if you cannot travel back in time to that point, then that information is probably more likely going to fall under the semantic category. Now, there are some similarities. Obviously, both are declarative. Both are flexible too. So both can be communicated flexibly in a different format from which it was originally required. For example, if you saw a car accident earlier today, that's a visual piece of information that you can now communicate verbally. And same with semantics. You can acquire that information non-verbally and then talk about it. But there are these major distinctions here that we've already talked about. Okay, so semantic memory always starts out episodic. So when you learn something, there's always a particular time and a place. You just might not remember it because that time and place information is not automatically stored with semantic information. But semantic memory can be enhanced if it's associated with episodic memory. So I probably will never forget that George Washington was the first president of the United States because that is a good story. And this is one of the reasons why I try to tell a lot of stories when I'm giving a lecture. I think the experience of me telling a story is more episodic than just explaining it. So a little bit of color commentary thrown in here and there can make the semantic information more salient. You might not be able to remember a definition of something, but you might be able to mentally time travel back to a point in time when I explained something and access the information through that route. Semantic memory can influence our experience by influencing our attention. So remember that list I gave you at the beginning of this recording? I'm going to read it out now. I want you to just pause, write down as many of those names as you can remember, and then see how you do. Here's that list: McDavid, Crosby, Matthews, Stone, Larkin, Nylander, Hughes, Comrie, Knight, and Talbot. Now, if you remembered any significant number of names on that list, my guess is that you watched the NHL, because those were the names of NHL players. And so semantic memory can influence our experience by influencing our attention. If you understand hockey, if you watch hockey, you have a certain level of semantic knowledge. That in turn allows you to remember episodic memory better. And yes, me presenting you a list at the beginning of this recording is in fact an episode. It's a specific experience that I was asking you to recall. I want to take a second though to explore this question of why we have episodic memory at all. We could say, for example, you could say that the reason we encode specific episodes from our lives is that it helps us to develop schemas or semantic understanding. So it might help us to remember like who specific or what specific predators are, or it might help us to remember where we found berries in the past, or it also might help us make predictions about how things will work. But actually, we do not need episodic detail to do all of that. That's all semantic information, right? Like, where are the good berries is semantic information. You don't have to remember the specific episode of finding them to remember that. Who is a potentially dangerous person in your community? Again, you don't have to remember that person doing something threatening or doing anything specific. You could just have a specific semantic memory of like, that person is dangerous, stay away from them. So why do we remember the specific details? Why do we keep a record of specific past experiences? It certainly makes storytelling more interesting, right? Like, and beers are much more entertaining when you can tell some stories. But the purpose can't just be something to give us to talk about over beers, right? Like, there has to be another reason why it is that we encode specific details of episodic events. Sheldon, Andrews, and Moscovich had a very specific hypothesis. They suggested that the reason we remember the specific details of past events is about event simulation. That information is necessary for imagining the future or planning future events. Their hypothesis is that the same processes we use to recombine elements to reconstruct our past experiences are also being used to construct novel scenes, scenarios, and future events. If you have ever quit a job or broken up with somebody, you could see how this is true, right? You have a very specific simulation of what might happen. Like, I'm going to say this, and then they're going to say that, and then I'm going to say this. Wait, that's a bad idea. Let me back up. And you start over again. You start that scenario over again. To test their hypothesis, Sheldon et al. Created an open-ended social problem-solving task. And open-ended problems, social problems are problems that don't have one specific solution. So participants can't just store them and recall them in semantic memory. They have to create a solution. In this experiment, here's the premise for their social problem-solving task. Mrs. P came home after shopping and found that she had lost her watch. She was upset about it. The story ends with Mrs. P finding her watch and feeling good about it. So participants in this experiment were instructed to try to describe a plausible scenario where you got from point A to point B. Like, how do you fill in that gap? Here's one solution that is I've taken from the article just to give you an example. So this is a verbal report. It's a little bit strange that way. So what I had done from the time I got out of the car, going into the store, shopping, and then coming back, taking every move I had made, the time I shut the car door, I locked the car door to make sure I did not take off the watch while in the car, and then when I was walking to and from the store to ensure that it didn't fall off my wrist. So I looked around the parking lot as I was walking through, and then once I was checking the carts that I was pushing while shopping, and then I checked the aisles that I had walked through, and to the point where I had to pick up medication as well, and when I was standing in line to pay for my products. I asked any specific individual who I had seen again from the first time I was in. And also the most obvious step that I had taken once going back into the store was to ask employees if a watch had been turned in. So when I contacted the employee had went and brought Mrs. P to the lost and found, where any lost items are turned in, which is where she had the opportunity to look within the lost and found and realize her watch was turned in. She felt good about it because it was a sentimental gift given to her for her 25th birthday. Okay, so that's one of the responses that was given. Sheldon et al. Actually tested two groups of participants, control participants and then participants who had temporal lobe epilepsy. Temporal lobe epilepsy is literally epilepsy where seizures are starting in the temporal lobe, and eventually what happens is that the temporal lobe acquires damage over the long term and produces episodic memory deficits. So testing controls and testing participants with temporal lobe epilepsy, they analyzed their answers to identify the number of episodic details participants reported and semantic details. An example of a semantic detail was that the watch was given to her for her 25th birthday. So that was something that wasn't necessary. It wasn't a specific event that happened in the story. It was just a semantic detail. So using this breakdown, researchers found that the control participants reported far more episodic details in their social problem solving compared to the participants with temporal lobe epilepsy. But in terms of the semantic detail, there was no difference between those two groups. What this led them to propose was the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. Episodic memories are extracted and recombined to construct simulations of future events. And that's why we remember the specifics. That's why we remember the specific details of past episodic events. It's not about what's happened in the past. It's about what's likely to happen in the future. All right, so this is where you can go and do the long-term memory H5P. All right, one last overview. Sensory memory, brief. Maintaining information just long enough for us to like glue together our world or to remember the beginning of a sentence by the time we get to the end of a sentence. Short-term memory, what we're doing right now. We've got visual information, we've got verbal information, and then we've got the central executive doing the work. And then long-term memory divided into declarative, non-declarative, with a special emphasis on episodic and semantic memory. So this is part of the systems view and looking at the different structures. What kinds of memory are we talking about? So this area of memory research emphasizes the different kinds of memory and its specific characteristics related to the type, capacity, and duration of information. Next module, we'll be talking about memory processes, which actually looks at memory from a completely different perspective. So it's the end of this lecture. You should be able to explain the ways that people tend to think about memory, describe the modal model of memory, explain how researchers determine the capacity and duration of short-term memory, summarize the Brown-Peterson paradigm, compare and contrast decay and interference, predict the results of novel experiment scenarios that exploit interference, explain the difference between short-term and working memory, summarize Baddeley's model of working memory, describe the difference between short-term and long-term memory, explain the serial position curve and its associated effects and its implications, define anterograde amnesia, summarize HM's contribution to our understanding of memory, recognize the difference between declarative and non-declarative memory, compare and contrast episodic and semantic memory, describe how episodic and semantic memory interact with each other, and explain the proposed purpose of episodic memory and the evidence to support that proposal. All right, see you next time.